Now, the question is, once they stop us, then what? What usually happens? They want to talk to us. So the next question then is, do I have to talk to the police? The short answer to that is, nope, you do not. You have a right to not speak with the police. That is what the Fifth Amendment is. We have the right to remain silent. We don't have to talk to them. Now, the Fifth Amendment technically says you have the right against self-incrimination. What that means is I don't have to tell the cops anything that would be against my interest. In other words, I don't have to tell them that I committed a crime, right? I don't have to incriminate myself. I don't have to prove their case for them. I don't have to talk to them. So that's really what it comes down to. I don't have to ever. You have the right to not talk to them. And if you wanted to, at any point, you could tell the officer, I have the right to remain silent and I'm going to exercise it. I do not wish to speak to you. So this is one I always like, okay? I won't ask for a raise of hands because I can only see a couple people's pictures right now, but
Jason, let me ask you this. Did you exercise this right in your lifetime?
Yes, once, sort of, trickily. Okay, let me tell you what I did. So Mehmet will probably know this area, and if anybody lives in the Logan area, you'll know it. The town of Manaway is notorious for pulling people over, right, for traffic tickets. I had to go up for a meeting in Logan, was driving through there, and yes, I was going too fast up the hill, right? I was in a little car. I had some momentum. I wasn't going to let it die, and I got caught going like 10, 15 over the speed limit, okay? So what then happens? The officer comes up, and what does the officer always ask when you get pulled over for a traffic violation?
Do you know why I stopped you?
Exactly. Do you know why I stopped you? They're not asking that to be polite. They're asking that for you to incriminate yourself. If you say, oh yeah, you pulled me over because I was speeding, I've just admitted that I was speeding. Now I can't really go to court and contest the fact that I was speeding because I already admitted to the officer I was speeding. Yeah, they're not asking to be nice. They're asking you so you make their job easier and they don't have to go to court and defend the case. If you confess to it, then it makes their job that much easier. So this officer pulled me over and asked me that question. Do you know why I pulled you over? I handed him my license and registration. I said, here you go. And I just didn't address his question. So he asked me again. He's like, do you know why I pulled you over? It's like, yeah, do you need anything else from me? I just ignored his question, right? Do I have the right to do that? Absolutely. Just because the police officer asked me a question does not mean I have to answer it, right? Now, this does get tricky with speeding tickets, right? Because I have the right to remain silent, but if a cop pulls me over for going, let's say, a couple miles over the speed limit, 7 or 8 miles over the speed limit, and he says, license and registration, do you know why I pulled you over? And I look him in the eye and say, I have the right to remain silent. I don't have to tell you anything. Do you think I'm going to get a warning on that speeding ticket? Probably not, right? If I am combative with the officer, they're probably not going to give me a break on that case. So there is that trade-off, right? Do I be nice to the cop and try and be chummy and hope he or she gives me a warning? Maybe. Do I exercise my right to remain silent and say nothing? And there's a bit of a trade-off with those lesser offenses, right? Like traffic offenses. Sometimes we might roll the dice and say, okay, you ask me how fast I'm going, I can say, sorry, I went a little bit over, running late for a meeting. I know that's not an excuse. Sorry so much, right? And then maybe I get a warning, right? So there's that trade-off we always have to balance. But the short of it is I don't have to tell them. I don't have to do that. There are ways you can go about it, like I did. Like I said, when I say I did it trickily, it's like just because they asked me the question, I don't have to answer it, and I don't have to demand, no, I have the right to remain silent. Stop your questioning, officer. I don't have to do that. I just don't have to answer his questions, right? I certainly can tell him that if I wish to, but that's where we're at with that, right? So yeah, I have utilized this in a roundabout sort of way, okay? So yeah, you have that right. You don't have to talk to the police. Now, let's suppose then, we see this in popular culture, TV, movies, all of that. You're right. Officers, arrest the bad guy, right? And then they have to read them all these rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Why do officers have to tell us that? And if so, when? These are what we call Miranda warnings. The reason they are called that is it's named after a case, a gentleman with the last name Miranda versus the state of Arizona. So that case involved a gentleman who was charged with, if I'm remembering correctly, some form of sexual assault, kidnapping perhaps, down in Arizona, confessed to the police, and then after the fact, his attorneys claimed, well, my client did not know that he had the right to remain silent. He didn't know that he could ask for an attorney before he talked to the police. So yeah, he confessed the whole thing to the police. And then they argued that that was fundamentally unfair. How can we hold people accountable, right? What good is a right that no one knows about? And so the court went to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court agreed and said, yeah, people ought to know their rights, and the police ought to inform them of those so that they can make an informed decision whether or not to talk to the police. Because of that, we now have the Miranda warnings. They are the warnings that come essentially word for word out of that Supreme Court case. So the basics of them are the police have to tell someone that they have the right to remain silent, like we've talked about. You don't have to talk to the police. The police have to tell them, you don't have to talk to us. You have the right not to if you do not wish to. You have to inform them that if they do choose to talk to you, right, if it's a police officer, if you choose to talk to me, anything you say, it could be used against you when this goes to court, right? So be careful what you say, right? Because it could be used against you, even though you think it might be helping your case. If it ends up that it hurts it, we can still use that against you. And then the last one is that they have a right to an attorney during the what we call the interrogation process. So while the police officer is talking to you, if you do wish to talk to the police, you can request that an attorney be present with you. That way you have an attorney to say, okay, stay away from this area. Don't talk about that. You can talk about this. So you have the right to request an attorney. And if you cannot afford an attorney, then one's provided for you at no cost. And that is a right we have in the United States. You have a right to an attorney, not just rich people, right? It's not just rich people that have a right to an attorney. Everybody does. So even if you are poor, the term they use in courts is indigent. Indigent is just a fancy word for poor. If you don't have enough money to hire an attorney, you get one provided by the county, by the state. Right? You have what they call the public defender's office. They are the attorneys that are paid to represent people who cannot go out and pay for a private attorney.
Jason, I have a question.
Sure.
So for the, they have the right to remain silent, you are saying, and anything they say may be used against them. So is it, I watched When They See Us, Netflix, the film. It's not a documentary, I guess. It's a film. It's a TV show. I really loved. And in 1980s, I guess, or 85, the coercion was done by the police officer. Was it because of that, the protection?
I'm not familiar with that case specifically, but there are different ways that we get into coercion, because you are right. The key thing that we look at when determining whether the things you say can be used by the police against you in court is whether or not you voluntarily said those things to the police. So anything that is deemed to have coerced your testimony, coerced your confession, if it's believed that your confession was coerced, then we can't use it in court. So one of the things that the court will look at is whether or not these warnings were read. If they were not read, the court's going to determine that it was a coerced confession. Right? You're going to say, well, you intentionally didn't tell them their rights, so they didn't know about them, so they couldn't use them. So you, in essence, did that to coerce them to confess to everything. We're going to get into some other ways that you can coerce a confession as well. This isn't the only way. This just happens to be sort of the first, gate you have to pass through as an officer. Now, I do want to make sure I note one thing on here. These warnings only have to be read when you are in custody. Or to use the term that we used in the last slide, when you're seized, are you free to leave? If you're not free to leave and the cops wish to talk to you, they know that they're not going to let you go. They've got to read you these warnings. Okay. If you are free to leave, they do not have to read you these warnings, right? Maybe the police decide to call you in relation to a crime on the phone and ask you some questions. Am I free to leave if I'm having a phone conversation with them? Sure, I can hang up the phone, set it down, and be about my business. I would not be seized at that point. I wouldn't be in custody. So they wouldn't have to read me my Miranda rights before they started asking me questions over the phone, right? But if I'm taken into police custody and put in an interrogation room, yeah, I'm seized at that point. They have to read me my warnings before they talk to me. Okay. And then there's a lot of gray area in between. What if they stop me on the car on the side of the road and they haven't put me in handcuffs? They haven't told me I'm under arrest, but clearly they've pulled me over and I don't feel like I can just drive off. Am I in custody at that point? Am I seized? Do they have to read me my Miranda warnings then? I would argue, yeah, they probably should to be on the safe side, but we do get in some gray area there. Am I really free to leave just because I don't feel that I'm free to leave? Does that mean I'm not free to leave? That's why that gets to be the core question with a lot of this stuff. But yep.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
So there is a really good question. Do immigrants, even if they are legally here, have less rights comparing to citizens?
No. Now, the protections in the United States Constitution apply to everybody here. Okay, so I ran into this a lot. Like I said, I was in Arizona when I prosecuted, so we had, and I did the drug prosecutions for several years there. So anytime someone was transporting drugs along the interstates, usually over the US-Mexico border, they'd come up through Phoenix and then out from Arizona to the rest of the country. We had a lot of people from Mexico, Central America, South America that would get pulled over and were not US citizens. They still had these same rights. If the cops were going to talk to them, they had to read them their Miranda warnings if they were in custody. If the police wanted to pull them over, they had to have some evidence that some criminal activity was afoot. So yeah, these rights do not apply only to citizens. They apply to everybody here. That's a great question. So those are your Miranda warnings. And oh yeah, I mentioned that last point. You can get a free attorney if you can't afford one. I want to go over a couple of things here because as Mehmet sort of alluded to, the question we have to look at is, was the confession confessed, right? Did you get somebody to talk against their will? And there's other ways that you can do that besides just not reading their Miranda warnings. So the question becomes, what about promises? Do you think the police can make promises to a suspect to get them to say something legally? What do you think?
Legally, no, but because of power dynamics, I guess.
Yeah, when we look at this, it depends, right? Realistically, we do this all the time. A promise, for example, a plea agreement, right, is really just a promise. If you do this, right, we will give you that. Again, I ran into this a lot of the time doing drug interdiction cases. We'd have the police officers would pull over a suspect, right, and they would have, 10 pounds of meth in the car or however much they had. And the cops would say, look, you're not really the person we're after, right? We know that you're just transporting it, and you're not the top of the organization. We want the person at the top. So if you tell us who organized this for you, tell us the person right above you who sent you on this expedition to take drugs across the country, we'll cut you a break. We won't send you to prison because we know that people who help the cops out, who provide information, have shortened life expectancies when they go to prison, right? So if you help us out, we will promise you that you won't go to prison. Is that a promise? Absolutely. Is it legal? The answer is yes, as long as you follow through on that promise. Can the cop say, oh yeah, we'll cut you a break if you tell us everything? And then when they tell you everything, you can't, and the cops go, psych, we were just kidding. Yeah, that's a problem. You can't do that. Law enforcement can't do that. But they can make promises like this. In drug cases, it happens all the time, right? As long as you follow through on what you promised, it's deemed to be voluntary. You laid out the terms of the agreement. They knew what they were, and based on those terms, they wanted to talk. That's going to be okay as long as you follow it. So there is that element that cops can use.
Okay, one question.
Sure.
Without a court order or warrant, do you have a right to call off the interrogation or search in your car or home?
That's a detailed question. The answer is yes, sort of. And I'm going to get into that in the next part when we get into can the police search and take my stuff. So remind me when we get to that part to circle back around to it, because the answer is sort of. It depends on the circumstances, right? Generally, you have to have a warrant, but there's some exceptions, and we're going to get into those. But great question. Yeah, forecasting where we're going with this. What about threats? Can the police threaten you to get a confession out of you?
If I were a cop, obviously.
No, yeah, I mean, the short answer is, yeah, do they do it? Sometimes, right? But should they? No, right? The short answer is no. Now, we have to look at the line between a threat and letting people know the consequences, right? So if someone comes up, you get someone and they're arrested, and you sit down as the detective and you say, look, we caught you. We've got evidence that you murdered Sally, right? You know how much time you're looking at? You're looking at 25 years minimum, and we might pursue the death penalty. I mean, that's what you're looking at legally. It might go a long way to, help your case or help the judge at sentencing to see that you're being at least cooperative at this stage to maybe get a lesser sentence, right? Is that a threat? Yeah, that gets within the gray area, right? Essentially, you're saying, wow, theoretically, we could lock you up for 25 years and kill you. But if you cooperate, maybe that won't happen. I mean, it's in that really gray area. You're telling them legally what the consequences will be. So that wouldn't be a threat. And the courts probably wouldn't construe it as that. But when you pass over that line and say, look, if you don't do this, we're going to do this to your family. We're going to, break your legs. Yeah, that clearly is on the other side of things. You cannot do that. That would clearly be
Here's a related question, Jason. What if you are forced to confess to a crime that you didn't commit? Like if you are threatened by the cops and are scared.
If you have the police where you're threatened into a confession, that's where the right to an attorney is really important, because this does unfortunately happen on occasion. So if you do confess, but it was done under circumstances where it was not voluntary, it was clearly threatened out of you, forced out of you, you would come back in court and challenge this. That's where your attorney would file what they call a motion to suppress the evidence, which means throw the evidence out. So that's where your attorney would come in and say, yeah, my client confessed, but here's what they did. They threatened her. They beat him, whatever it happened to be that they did. That's where you could bring it up and prove to the court that that's what happened. And then it would get thrown out at that point. So, this is with our rights, right? There's what legally should happen, and then there is what actually happens, right? So even though the police should follow these guidelines, they don't always do that. Sometimes they, abuse that intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, right? There are plenty of cops I worked with that, they had great intentions. They weren't trying to violate someone's rights. They just got a little bit excited or overzealous in a case, and we had to have some evidence thrown out. It happens. Okay. But that is when you have the chance to address that. The unfortunate thing is, what happens to me in the interim? You might be in custody for a bit until that happens, which, there are the downsides to that, unfortunately, but that is the way our system is set up to address it. Is when it gets to court, then that's why you have the right to an attorney, so they can review all of this, hear your side of the story, and make those motions for you to get evidence thrown out. Great question on that. All right. Ooh, this one's an interesting one. Physical coercion, right? Can the cops physically coerce you? The answer is no, right? We know that they can't torture us, right? They can't put us on the rack and stretch us out or put the thumb presses on us or anything like that. And, cops know that. All of us know that. That's just, we look at that and say, no, that just does not seem right at all. There are some more subtle ways, though, that the police can physically coerce a confession. And this is the example you brought up, Mehmet. I don't know if this applies in this case, but I know there are documentaries where this gets to be the case, and confessions get thrown out. But what if the police keep me awake for 18 hours in the same room, and they don't let me leave the room until I confess? Is that physical coercion? It would be, right? So that's more what we see now, where it might get problematic with the police. It's not, they're not going to torture you and break your thumbs and things like that, but there's little subtle things they might do, right? I take you into an interrogation room, and I make you stay there until you confess. I make sure the room's nice and cold. I don't let you go to the bathroom. I don't bring you anything to eat. So you're starving, you've got to pee, and you're tired, and you're freezing, right? And you just want it to end. It's like, come on, if you can go lay down if you just tell me what happened, right? In an instance like that, the court might look at it and say, yeah, that's physically coercive. You use those methods to make them uncomfortable and wouldn't let them leave until they said what happened. You can't do that. That's more of what we see now. An interesting story, because I had a student bring this up to me. I hadn't read this news article when it came out, but a student asked me about it and pointed out, hey, this is what the cops are doing. In the news, it's got to be about 5 years ago. I cannot remember the person's name. You had, I think it was an 18-year-old white male who went to a black church in South Carolina and killed a lot of people. I forget how many, right? And that got to be a national news story there for a bit. Now, apparently, the cops, after they arrested this 18-year-old, took him to like Burger King or something like that before they went back and interrogated them. And a lot of news outlets sort of lost their mind. It's like, oh, the cops are in on this. They're buying dinner for a guy who just killed a bunch of black people. Why are the cops doing that? The short of it is that's not what the cops are doing when they take someone to McDonald's. What they're doing, or Burger King or wherever they take them, they're trying to avoid a claim that they're being physically coercive in their tactics to get them to confess. Because if they get a confession out of this guy, let's say, and then he comes back at trial and said, oh, they locked me up in this room and they didn't feed me, they didn't let me go to the bathroom, they compelled my confession, that's not going to be good for the cops. They want his confession if he confesses. So what do a lot of police officers do in advance? They make sure that they take steps to combat that argument. They take him to McDonald's or Burger King and say, here, have a Big Mac. Now you can't complain that we're starving you until you give a confession. We want to make sure that we're treating you properly so you can't say this is coerced. So you might see things like that where you'd see the cop and say, oh, the cops, they're just being buddy-buddy and treating them to dinner. No, that's not what they're doing. They're trying to avoid any sort of claims that they're being coercive. So that's sometimes what you'll see. A cop will be very nice, if when they're doing this, here, can I get you a drink? You want to go to the bathroom? Please sit down. They want to avoid some claim that they're being physically coercive. All right, last one. This one's interesting. Can the police lie to you? What do you think?
Yes.
I see heads nodding. Yeah, yes. The answer is yes. They can lie to you, right? They can come in and say, hey, we've got all this evidence. You might as well just confess so the judge thinks it'll look better, right? And that can be completely false, and it's okay. The police are able to lie to you, right? One of the common ones I saw that was always interesting, right? When you had these drug cases where two people were in a car transporting drugs, right? They pull them over. And so the cop will go to the first one and say, hey, your buddy just told us everything that happened and ratted you out. You might want to save your neck here and tell us what happened, when none of that actually happened. And then they'll go to the second guy and tell him the same thing and get confessions out of both. So can the police legally do that? Yes. The short answer is yes. So just because the police tell you something when you're being interrogated does not necessarily mean it's the truth. They can tell you they have all sorts of evidence. That doesn't mean that they actually have it. They are legally permitted to lie to you. The one exception to that would be in relation to promises that, like I mentioned before, they can't lie to you and say, we'll give you a plea agreement that makes sure you don't go to prison if you confess, and then not follow through with that. That would be a problem. But just about the facts of a case to try and trick somebody into confessing to something, they are legally permitted to do that.